But today our guest is Mark L. Levine. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Levine. Mr. Levine is a lawyer, writer, and teacher who practiced corporate banking and publishing law in New York City for more than 40 years. He's also an experienced voter protection lawyer. His other books include Negotiating a Book Contract and The Complete Book of Bible Quotations. A graduate of Columbia College, the NYU School of Law, and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He has taught at Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College. He's very kindly joining us today to discuss the book he edited with George McNamee and Daniel Greenberg, The Trial of the Chicago Seven, which I have behind me and he has behind him. Originally published in 1970 under the title The Tales of Hoffman, it documents the trial of the men the government charged with inciting violence and rioting during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Mr. Levine, along with his co-editors, purchased the first 15,000 pages of the trial transcript from the court reporter while the trial was ongoing. Having pulled out the critical moments and condensed the events to a little under 400 pages, this book of excerpts was published in early 1970, just 10 or, he says, hit stores about 11 days after the trial concluded. Last year, your book was re-released as a 50th anniversary edition with a foreword by Aaron Sorkin. And today, again, we're very glad to have you join us because we wanted to talk about how you came to put this book together in 1969 and then try to set the trial in its historical context a bit for those who don't know and to refresh those who do. And finally, to contrast it with the Aaron Sorkin film, which came out on Netflix in September of 2020. So I think you were living in New York at the time and you gathered maybe 20 people in your apartment to tear through what was over a 20,000 page trial transcript and edit it down.
Yeah, and what had happened actually was my friends and I were reading, there was not a lot of coverage of the trial. We're looking back in a time where no 24-hour news stations, certainly no 24-hour cable stations. In fact, 24-hour radio news stations had only started a couple of years before, and there were only probably 2 of them. And there was not a lot of coverage of the trial. I was reading in the New York Times their occasional articles by a very good journalist named Anthony Lucas. And what I was reading was just outrageous. We could not believe the brief colloquies that the Times reported, nor could we believe what was happening, particularly with Bobby Seale and everything else. We were just astounded, and we basically said, more people should know about this. And if what the little we're seeing is so outrageous, what else is there? And we just basically wanted to get the story out so people would know what was going on. It was really, it's like Sorkin's movie today has introduced the event. So we'll talk about the movie later, to where it takes creative license with what happened there and where it's accurate. But the way Sorkin, nobody had remembered, very few people have remembered the trial until now. And Sorkin, I think, did a great public service by bringing that movie out as well as when he did. But that's what we wanted to do back then. There was no big movie about it. We wanted people to hear about this. And we were fortunate enough to get Bantam Books to publish it. And the way we did it, because we only got the idea for this a month before, late January. Trial ended 3rd week of February. So we basically, and again, this is the time when before FedEx, basically before word processors almost. Before fax machines, not that there are fax machines anymore, now we're beyond fax machines, but there was virtually no way to get information out. What we did, I called the court reporter and we made the arrangements to pick up the first batch of transcript. And the way we got it here, and we got it, I think, probably on February 6th or 7th, my co-author, Danny Greenberg, who I've been friends with forever, the court reporter literally had to get somebody to put because again, no FedEx. They had to bring the 15,000 pages to an airplane at Delta Airlines at O'Hare Airport. Danny, at 4:30 in the morning, went out to LaGuardia Airport and picked up from people getting off the plane this package which had the transcript. And what we then did was we got around 20 or 30 of our friends, some putting in more hours than others, people from work, people from friends, college graduates, in the apartment that George McNamee and I shared on 84th Street, a small 1-bedroom. And basically for the next 3 weeks, on a 24-hour basis, people rolling in and out. I went to my day job, but try to leave right at the end of the day. But we had people 24 hours a day going in and out of the apartment. We had pizza orders coming from all over. People were literally, because sometimes there's not a lot of room there. People were literally, I remember somebody sitting in the tub, eating pizza and reading transcript. What we did, because people have asked me, what did you choose? Because it is a 22,000 page transcript. And I think it's a little around 300, a little more than in this book, and the other one is in the original book is 270 pages. We had to trim it considerably. I mean, we probably made a mistake in renaming this book with the subtitle, The Official Transcript. That's probably a mistake, because people think of transcripts as boring, and generally they are. Generally they are. But this one basically reads like a script. It really does. So what we basically did is we got rid of all the boring stuff that was not essential. We told the people who were there our criteria. The first thing we said, look, it has to be fair down the middle. I mean, all of us were on the left progressive side of the spectrum, but we said, this has to be fair, it has to be down the middle. Take out anything you consider unusual. We want to show the contrasts. We want to show the clash between the cultures, because this is what it was. The trial, like the time, was a clash between the counterculture, whether they were long-haired hippies or people like Dave Dellinger in his jacket and tie, and the quote establishment. And back then, the establishment was personified by Richard Nixon and John Mitchell. Nixon ran on the supposed law and order ticket, which meant no dissent, whether you're black, whether you're long hair, whatever, no dissent. And that's what we asked him to do, and to pick up all those verbal exchanges. And one of the funny things, and the interesting thing about doing it, periodically, again, you got a picture, it's a big room in a small apartment, and people, you got to hear this one. And people would just read out loud the transcript, because the colloquies in the transcript are really amazing, the back and forth. In fact, the appellate court, when they reversed the trial judge's rulings, basically said there were over 150 instances where they felt the judge provoked the defendants. 150. And we probably have a lot of them in here. I mean, if it wasn't so serious, I'd say it reads like a joke book.
It does.
Because you've read it, and it's back and forth. You would not believe the dialogue. I mean, at one point, the judge doesn't permit Weinglass to get information from a witness, and judge says, that's enough now. And Weinglass says, Judge, I put a lot of time preparing this witness. I think you should talk. Put in a lot of time. What do you want, a gold star? That's what the judge said. What do you want, a gold star? And things like that throughout the transcript. Kunstler cites something in the Constitution, and Hoffman says, well, we have the Constitution out here in the Midwest too, or they object to something, and Kunstler says, you didn't let me object. Well, I'm not going to rule on it. I'm going to overrule it anyway. So why are you going to object? I mean, the dialogue. I mean, the judge was an amazing character. I mean, I'll tell you this about the movie, and I think the movie is great. I think the movie really captures the spirit of the trial and the spirit of the times. It does a brilliant job at that. But it's just not. Let me say this. Believe it or not, if you read the transcript or the edited transcript here, the movie takes it easy on the prosecution and takes it easy on the judge.
That's right.
The trial was worse. Hard to believe, but the trial was worse.
It's quite astounding. And I forgive me, because I'm also joined by my colleague, Rory Martorana, who also read the book and saw the movie, and she may have some questions of her own. But in the movie, I mean, just to take one example, which is maybe the most egregious and infamous, is the binding and gagging of Bobby Seale by the judge. And in the movie, that is terrible, graphic, of course, because you can see it, but it only lasts a brief time. And after that, it feels like, things have really turned in the direction of the defendants because of this, and Seal is released from custody, and the judge declares a mistrial for Seal, I believe, on that basis, and he's severed from the other 7 defendants. But in reality, it seems like that went on for several days.
Absolutely. I mean, in the movie, it's maybe 2 or 3 hours. They just come back. You see Bobby Seal is in the courtroom, chained and gagged. And before the prosecution puts on one other witness, before even one, Schultz, more about him later, Schultz asked the judge for a mistrial. Not the way it happened. Bobby Seal was in that courtroom for 4 days. 4 days, bound and gagged. And each time they brought him in, because he managed to speak through the gag or make sounds, each time they brought him in, they gagged him more. At the end, they had a bandage from under his chin over his head and a wrapped around, in addition to one going across. As Seal says, I could feel the blood pounding in my head, just literally pounding. So it's 4 days. So there's no way that the horror was worse. And there was no way that Schultz was sympathetic to anybody except the prosecution. By the way, Schultz was not even the main prosecutor. Tom Foran, or Foran, some people pronounce it, right, was the main prosecutor. They made him a bit player there. But they also made Schultz very sympathetic, and he's not. He's a good prosecutor. Not going to deny that. But even he got carried away, and his conduct was criticized, as well as Foran. I mean, the court basically said, even without going to the merits, I mean, the prosecution's conduct, as well as the judges, were enough to make it contempt. But he wasn't sympathetic. He never would have moved like that, right away. He was horrified. I mean, the movie at the beginning shows him trying to convince Mitchell not to prosecute the defendants. Not at all true. There was a meeting in Washington with John Mitchell, Tom Foran, and Dick Schultz, but Foran and Schultz went down there with the draft of the indictment. So there was he had no qualms. He just was not a sympathetic character. It makes for a good movie, and I'm not criticizing that in terms of a movie. I mean, you only have 2 hours and you're trying to convey certain conflict and everything. I see part of one of the questions somebody's asking, why do I think the filmmakers did that? Is that the question, Isaac?
Which question are you referring to?
I said at the beginning of somebody's question on the chat saying, why did the filmmakers?
Why do you think the filmmakers chose to make the judge less abhorrent? Mm-hmm.
I think making him as abhorrent it was, nobody would have believed it.
Right.
But what they did, there was more of a character. And if you take a look at the actual judge, I mean, Langella, sort of a Johnny One Note. I mean, he played the role, played well the role, but that was not what happened. He was not a big angry man saying, "Listen to me, take it my way or the highway." Physically, he's also very different. He's a short little guy. His law clerk said he looked like Mr. Magoo. But he was a mean, nasty, sarcastic person. He never boomed out his voice. In a movie, yes, it makes it easier to show the contrast by having a big booming voice and shutting people down. But he had a nasty sense of humor, and he goaded them. Sarcasm all over the place. As I said, if you read the transcript, there are these sound bites, these brief dialogues. I mean, Sorkin could have done it that way, but I mean, you're doing a movie, and you have to like anything, if you're making a movie of Gone with the Wind or Moby Dick, you simplify and figure how to get it across.
Right. There are really ludicrous exchanges, and especially earlier on, not knowing the tone of the trial and just kind of reading the transcript, you might think, oh, the judge and Kunstler are kind of having a little fun with each other. And it's like, as time goes on, of course, it becomes more and more aggressive and acrimonious. But I imagine it was probably like that from the beginning. But just some of the back and forth about, I mean, towards, the judge is constantly complaining that people are laughing in the courtroom. And, the defense lawyer, Kunstler, is saying, well, a little laughter is natural. You've said things that have provoked laughter. And the judge says, well, it wasn't intentional. It wasn't intended to provoke laughter. And Kunstler says, well, it does. And the judge says, well, I'm not a humorist. And then, shortly thereafter, he's talking about how the tonal qualities of his voice have been compared to Orson Welles. I mean, this is the judge, during the trial. And so he has these really eccentric tangents that are kind of hard to reconcile, on paper with just how nasty he is, and towards the end of the trial, Kunstler at one point asks, or could you raise the heat a little bit, because it's cold in the courtroom. And the judge says, well, I'm not the janitor. I can't be stoking the furnace. I have a robe, but, I can't lend it to you. He's just extremely sarcastic.
He enjoyed it. Hoffman enjoyed what was going on. This trial would have been totally different if it had an ordinary judge. Most judges in the system, I'd say 99.5% of judges in the system would have handled the trial differently. And the publicity would have been far less. It just wouldn't have been that way. He engaged, he enjoyed being a player. You can hear the comment about his voice sounding like Orson Welles. He enjoyed the give and take. And as I say, the appellate court and the appeal said, basically, a lot of what he did was provoke the defense. It was, it's interesting. He was the third judge chosen. The first two judges, normally what you do is in these courts, you basically like a lotto game. You pick a ball out of a drum to see who the winner is in the sweepstakes. And I remember people saying they thought, it was fixed that they gave it to him because they knew he was a hanging judge. But no, they were picking it out. But the first two judges, they asked to do it. Not me. I'm not going to get in the middle of this. Too controversial. I'm not going to. There was an article I read recently by Hoffman's law clerk, who was not the law clerk at the trial because she was about to leave 3 months in. So she was observing everything that was going on. She said, he couldn't turn it down. He couldn't say it was too controversial for me. His ego was such he had to take it. And he loved the role. He loved the attention.
He was, as I learned, only at the end, he was born in 1895, which today seems impossible. At the time, he was 70, but he very much, as you say, I think, represented that older order, and was, I would imagine, affronted by the behavior of the defendants, or at least he claimed that he was.
Well, no, I think it's a very, very good word, Isaac. I think he was definitely, by the way, 70, he was more than twice the age of everybody except David Dellinger. Probably, maybe exactly twice David Dellinger. But, the defendants were most of them between 25 and 30. But what's interesting is Hoffman considered himself a liberal. He considered himself a liberal. And he may have been a liberal. He may have been a New Deal liberal. A liberal as you defined it under FDR in 1932, when FDR passed a lot of great legislation, a lot of social welfare legislation. So he thought, I'm a liberal judge. And several times when he's accused of directly or indirectly of being a racist because of what happened with Bobby Seale, he basically says, well, it's almost like some of my best friends.
Right.
It was as bad as that. He said, I handled the first integration case. He could not fathom that he was being old, that he was out of step, and he couldn't take it, and therefore the repartee back and forth, it was just astounding.
I do have a question about sort of about the movie, but in the movie, that first scene where they go into the back room there and have a meeting, the defense, Abby Hoffman said that this is a political trial and they've already decided it for us. Not sure in real life if that happened, but in what ways was it a political trial? Because, you were talking before we started live about how we didn't have like the cable news networks and all that stuff today, but I'm sure everyone had their eyes on this. So
you're picking up on a very interesting point. The statement in the movie, again, contrast what Sorkin and a lot of good playwrights and screenwriters do is you try to set up contrasts and you try to show there's a progression in one's character from the beginning to the end. And in the movie, they try to say that Kunstler didn't believe in political trials, and towards the end, he said, "Oh my God, this is a political trial." That initial scene where Kunstler's saying there's no such thing as a political trial is almost libelous on Bill Kunstler. All he did for the 10, 20 years before that were political trials. He started out as an ordinary lawyer back in the late 40s, but he was representing freedom riders down south. He was dealing with a lot of cases involving race, lunch counters, all this. So he knew from the get-go that it was a political trial, and he did not have to be convinced at all of that. And one of the things that made it very unusual, which I'm not sure I don't remember the movie all that well. I've only seen it 2 or 3 times, but what started this whole thing off, and again, Bobby Seale was an add-on, as they point out in the movie. Bobby saying, "I wasn't there, I'm an add-on," and he wasn't. And as to a conspiracy, I mean, as Abby Hoffman said, both in, I think in the movie and in the book, we couldn't even agree on lunch, let alone a conspiracy. Bobby Seale was there maybe for 2 hours. He flew in to give a speech, and then was out of there. But at the beginning of the trial, lawyers are always busy, and judges' calendars are always postponements. They always have a backlog of cases, and they say, okay, to accommodate the lawyers, or they don't accommodate the lawyers. I mean, saying you're going on vacation, judge is not going to be that. But here, Charles Gary was having a gallbladder operation, and he was supposed to be the lead counsel. So they made a motion ahead of time. To postpone the trial for a couple of weeks till Gary could come back. And again, he was not only Bobby Seale's and the Panthers lawyer, he was going to be the lead lawyer for the whole group. And interestingly, by the way, from what I've read, Gary, who certainly believed in political trials, his theory for the trial might have been much straighter than Kunstler's and Lenny Weinglass's. But Judge Hoffman said, "No, I'm not going to delay this trial. It's an ordinary thing in court. For a lawyer who can't be there because he's having an operation, could have postponed it for 2 weeks." So the judge, right from the outset, was treating things differently.
Right. It was, yeah, go ahead.
No, please, Isaac.
Well, it was clearly a political trial. And I mean, at some point, it may have been early on in the trial, Fred Hampton was killed, which in the movie is a big event. In the transcript, it also seems like in reality, it seems like it was a big event. There were ongoing peace marches happening, and the judge just refused to concede that there was anything outside of the courtroom that might have any effect on what was going on.
You're right, and two things there about Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, an amazing human being, and the Panthers themselves. They started, breakfast programs for hungry kids in Oakland and throughout, but they got tarred with, made good theater and good copy. But Fred Hampton's role in that movie is basically all made up. Fred Hampton was assassinated in his bed. No doubt about it. That part of the movie is absolutely true. But the movie has Seale, his outburst that provoked his being chained was Fred Hampton's death. Bobby Seale was already severed from that trial a month before Fred Hampton died, before Fred Hampton was murdered. A month. So that whole piece there, Bobby was protesting because the way he was being treated, and he felt he was being treated that way because as a black man. And of course, Hoffman couldn't see. He was blind in that sense. He couldn't see that he was doing anything anti-black.
Right.
So the whole role of Hampton is very effective, and he's a great man, really an amazing person. But again, that's all artistic license.
One of the other things, of course, that I definitely wanted to ask you about is the end of the trial, which in reality was a real emotional crescendo. It seemed to me, and I may have a quote somewhere here, but Kunstler is making really impassioned speeches, as are all the defendants, because they were all handed by the judge contempt sentences of several years in prison just for their conduct during the trial. And that was considered, I'd like to know, speaking as a lawyer, is that completely unprecedented that he just sat on those contempt orders? But Kunstler is then just going on and saying, I've tried with all my heart faithfully to represent my clients in the face of what I consider and still consider repressive and unjust conduct toward them. And he, at one point, he's pleading with the judge, please sentence me. I just can't take this anymore. It's like, it reads like, I don't know.
It nearly broke him.
Greek tragedy, it's at that level.
Perfect analogy there. I say, in addition to our book having all this repartee, all these examples of back and forth, which is outrageous, witty, horrifying, we do also have excerpts, very eloquent excerpts from each of the defendants, right after they were being given contempt sentences and before they were sentenced. And those are well worth reading. It's not a give and take. But we've excerpted the speeches in their language, and we made them of a readable size. But they're incredibly eloquent. They knew they were going away to jail for a long time. They didn't know how long. They didn't know if they're going to get out on bail or anything else like that. And again, unlike the movie, the ending, of course, as we alluded to, was not the way it happened at all. But each of the defendants were given a chance to speak for themselves, and they did, and incredibly eloquently. The contempts, again, in the movie, you have 2 or 3 times. Again, it's a great rhetorical device, and it works because I think the movie captures the spirit, but it's just not history. It's not what happened. Okay, that's contempt. Another count of contempt for you. He direct the court reporter. Judge Hoffman never said the word contempt as it was going on. He would hint, well, we'll look at that later. The purpose of a contempt charges are to prevent trials from being disrupted, which means you have it right then and there, basically. You don't wait till the end, because giving sentences at the end is not going to change anybody's behavior. So if he wanted to do that, he should have basically called a timeout, and either he or another judge should have heard the contempt proceedings. And that would have changed things. As I say, the contempts are interesting. There were a total of 175 contempts charges brought at the end of the trial, given at the 159 at the end of the trial for the 7 defendants and 16 for Bobby Seale on November 5th when his case was severed from the others. So that's a total of 175. When there were separate appeals of the contempt charges and another separate appeal of the substantive convictions. The judge, at the end of the day, let me cut to the chase for a second. At the end of the day, of the 175, after all the appeals and reversals and remanding going back up and down the court system, only 13 were upheld. I think there was 7 against Dave Dellinger, 2 against Jerry, 2 against Abby, and 2 against Bill. Interestingly, the ones against Abby and Jerry were for their being in robes. That did happen. I don't know that they both had uniforms, cops' uniforms underneath. I think it was just one, and I think it was a cop, just a shirt, and I'm not even sure it was shown in the open courtroom. But only 13 were there. But what the court said in remanding being the technical term for saying, okay, these charges have to be retried, and they sent it down to a lower court to have a separate hearing. First of all, they said Julius Hoffman could not be the judge on the retrial. They basically said very explicitly, I mean, it's really, generally, appeals court judges don't try to criticize very heavily lower court judges. And the judges did not let the defendants go scot-free. I mean, the appellate provision, the appellate judges did criticize the defendants in a lot of what they said. But when they remanded it, when they sent the contempt charges back, they specified that it had to be a judge other than Judge Hoffman. And nobody in the Chicago area, in that circuit, none of the other judges wanted it or would take it. They had to go to Maine and get a Judge Janeau, Edmund Janeau, I think was his name. And he was from Maine, Federal District Court in Maine, and he was sitting by special designation in Chicago to hear these appeals. And there were a raft of reasons why they were tossed out. Some of them, when the appellate court sent them back, said the government decided not to retry them at all, because some of them they knew were ludicrous. But they basically said, if you're going to retry, if you're going to charge somebody with contempt, you got to do it right then and there.
Right.
To prevent, because the purpose of contempt is to prevent the abuse of the system.
And that is something that we don't see. I don't think we see that in the movie at all. The fact that at the end of this trial, while the jury is still deliberating, the judge is handing out these jail sentences, not just to all the defendants, but also to their two lawyers, Weinglass and Kunstler. And they make these impassioned speeches. I'll just quote a couple of them. Rennie Davis, when he's sentenced for contempt, he says, "Judge, you represent all that is old, ugly, bigoted, and repressive in this country. And I will tell you that the spirit at this defense table is going to devour your sickness in the next generation." And that was probably one of the more measured ones. Abby Hoffman at one point says to the judge that he is a disgrace to the Jews and that he would have served Hitler better. And as I said, Kunstler has many moments where he says things like, everything I've learned throughout my life has come to naught, that there is no meaning in this court and there is no law in this court. And finally, if I have to pay with my liberty for such representation, that is the price of my beliefs and my sensibilities. And at the very end, he sounded to me a little like Lou Gehrig kind of giving his famous farewell speech at Yankee Stadium when Kunstler is standing in before the judge and says, although he may not be the greatest lawyer in the world, he's the most privileged to be punished for what he believes in. And so then it's striking to know that these men believed they were going away for years potentially, and they were let out of jail 8 days later on appeal.
Yeah, Isaac, you've clearly done a very careful and good reading of the book, and I urge others to do so. I mean, I say if you like the movie, you'll love the book, because the substance is there as well as the repartee, and it reads well because these are people speaking. It's not like written words when turgid prose by lawyers or anybody else. What they say rings. I mean, it's almost like, to some extent, Sorkin had the script already there. But your careful reading, and those speeches at the end are incredibly, incredibly eloquent. I mean, the Kunstler one could almost like, I'd say, Lou Gehrig, very privileged, or almost to some saying, give me liberty or give me death. I mean, these guys really put the defendants and the lawyers put themselves on the line. Another interesting thing, let me point out about the contempt. Most of those charges happened after Bobby was gagged and chained. That's really what triggered a lot of the outrage. Until then, you didn't have as much of this. And by the way, the whole scene was set, again, going back to the history, before the trial began officially, in addition to Judge Hoffman ruling that he wouldn't postpone the trial because of Charles Gary, it's very typical for lawyers to get other people to help them out, particularly on a lot of the pretrial motions and pretrial papers. So you have lawyers doing different parts of it ahead of time. And then they're not the main players. They have other jobs. So they basically don't continue as lawyers. You just notify the court and that's it. Standard operating procedure. Judge Hoffman, when Michael Kennedy, Michael Tiger, Jerry left court, 3 or 4 lawyers who worked on the preliminary, when they tried to withdraw at the beginning, Judge Hampton said, "You can't withdraw. And if you're going to withdraw, you got to be here in my courtroom. I'm holding you all in contempt." He put 2 of those judges in jail. The legal world went batshit, pardon the language. You had Harvard professors, you had lawyers converging to march, if you will, in Chicago, because this was unheard of, just absolutely unheard of. And that, talking about demonstrations, this sort of sets the tone for what happened there. And so even then, he was basically rolling these guys in contempt, and literally, Jerry left court, who's still practicing. He's a criminal lawyer in Brooklyn, and he was in jail there, and to see actually what happens when you're in jail, you have no food. Or the food is not very edible. It was a sobering experience for him, and he's an amazing lawyer for defendants. So,
very much. We also, I don't know if we said this at the beginning, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. There's a Q&A function, which will work. There's a few different comments and questions here. And if people are not familiar with the trial, the other thing to know about it is just the astounding number of famous people who were called to testify during the trial. And I have a list here somewhere, but they include Pete Seeger,
Allen Ginsberg. That's the one that stuck out to me.
William Styron, and Judy Collins, Norman Mailer, Julian Bond, John Conyers, Dick Gregory, Phil Oakes, Jesse Jackson, Timothy Leary, Arlo Guthrie, and that's just some of them. And of course, the Attorney General under LBJ, Ramsey Clark, who was, I think, not really allowed to testify in front of the jury, which caused a lot of controversy.
Yes, one of the reasons the defense did that was because they were trying to show this is a clash of cultures. That the reason why they were marching in the streets and had the demonstration, and by the way, those scenes about the permits not being permitted are absolutely true. They would not grant the permits. And yes, the Justice Department did try to urge them. They did try to urge them to give the permits because they knew there would be less problems if permits. But Mayor Daley, old-time political boss, was absolutely determined not to allow them to march. So the defense had made the decision. It was not going to be a simple trespass charge or a simple conspiracy to riot charge. It was a clash of the cultures. They wanted to put the war on trial because that's what it was about. It was about the war. It was about the war, and not just about the American war dead. We've alluded to the fact that closing scene by Tom Hayden never happened. He never got up. He never read the list of war dead. That whole thing didn't, the movie did not end. The trial did not end with the judge banging his gavel for silence. Interestingly, Dave Dellinger did try to read the names of the war dead. He did it on something called Moratorium Day, which is October 15th, which was almost like a call for a national strike. I remember I went to work that day in my Wall Street law firm, very conservative Wall Street law firm, with a black armband. Did not get me a lot of cred with the law firm, with this very stodgy white shoe law firm. But Dave, before the court began, started reading the names of some of the war dead. And as soon as the trial started, Judge Hoffman said, "You can't do that." But Dave was not just reading the names of the American war dead. Dave was reading the names of the American and the Vietnamese war dead. Because the people against the war, it was a nationwide movement against the war, and it was a worldwide movement against the war. And a lot of people didn't want to go to the war, not because they were afraid of getting killed. They didn't want to kill other people they considered innocent. So I will say that. It was a clash of cultures, and what the trial did in terms of trying to make this, and that's why they put on all these other people. You're right about they called Ramsey to testify. By the way, I see somebody in the comment pointed out they wanted to call Groucho Marx. Groucho said he didn't think it was a good idea because he knew the jury would or the judge would make comments on the fact that name Marx, try to affiliate him with Karl Marx, which would not be good. But Ramsey Clark, an incredibly decent and good man, his testimony, which by the way, the appeals court said he should have been allowed to testify. What he could testify in the scope of the testimony would be a separate question. But as counsel said, either in the movie or the book, it was unheard of not to allow somebody to testify like that. But where the movie has some great emotional, feel-good, Aaron Sorkin feel-good highlight moments of, they have Ramsey saying, said two things mainly. One, that it was a police riot, that he said that his people had determined it was a police riot. And I'm trying to think the other major point. But that his people had also, his Justice Department recommended against indicting these people. Both of that's true. Both of those are true. But he did not say it, not even in the voir dire, because it's a big heroic moment. Everybody starts applauding it. It would be an applause moment, but he didn't say it even on the voir dire. He, again, it's good theater, good film, but artistic license.
A lot of
I
different.
don't mean to be trashing Sorkin. I think he did a great service by bringing out the movie and bringing out what he did when he did. I will point out, however, that a lot of the credit for the movie, in addition to the actors, goes to Steve Spielberg, not to Sorkin. Spielberg wanted to do this movie as early as 2008. He wanted to have it ready for the 2008 election. And he was going to direct it, and Sorkin was going to write the screenplay. But as Sorkin writes in his introduction to our book, because Sorkin wrote an introduction to our new edition, Sorkin said Spielberg called, they had trouble getting the financing. It's why it was postponed for 2008 to 2020, right? Long time. He called in Sorkin and said, hey, you've already done one movie. I'd like you to direct this one. And Sorkin says, great, I'd love to do it. It's going to be great. I definitely want to do it, Steve. And then he left Spielberg's house and called his father and said, Dad, what's the Chicago 7? I don't know anything about it. But it was really the heroism there in the decision to bring it out, to make it, I think goes to Spielberg, who does not get enough credit. I mean, he should share the credit with.
Yeah, and someone. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Isaac. When you're talking about Spielberg, so I'm a big film fanatic, right? So I'll watch movies a couple times over, and then I'll go on YouTube and find every interview I can and like analyze them when I'm interested. So this was one of those. And I think Steven Spielberg had said there were delays in the movie, as you mentioned, but this was the time. It had to happen now because there's so many parallels to our current cultural and political climate. But I was wondering if you could maybe, for some of us who are younger, because I asked my dad a lot of questions about this sort of thing too, since I wasn't there. There was so much going on around not just this trial, but like around it and leading up to the convention and all that. Like Bobby Kennedy and MLK were assassinated, and there was the war in Vietnam. People weren't happy with the potential nomination of Humphrey because they wanted Kennedy. Could you sort of set the scene there? Because I was kind of understanding it in the movie, but not quite, because I wasn't, I wasn't there.
No, you're right. I mean, the whole 60s, and people will say the 60s, I mean the 60s and the early 70s, was a period of amazing upheaval. Everybody's hopes were very big when John Kennedy was elected president. He was a new generation. He was the first of his generation, a young fellow, a handsome fellow, probably the first president that did not wear a hat at his inauguration. By the way, the Military Union was very upset with that because they had backed his candidacy. And they were annoyed because sales of hats went down in America when he appeared with no hat on. But it was a shining moment. People call it Camelot. Everybody was full of hope. Kennedy had his inauguration. Ask not what your country can do for you. ask what you can do for your country. He was appealing to the idealism of people, to young people, to college people, high school people, people in their 20s. He was appealing to that idealism. And everybody had the hope that things would be better. So you have, in terms of being theatrical, you had this great rise of hope. Everybody was, it was a new day. There was even a play on Broadway with Richard Burton, I think Elizabeth Taylor, called Camelot. And Camelot being a magical, mystical kingdom. And that's what Kennedy's years in the White House were considered. It was called the Camelot. It was exciting. Jackie Kennedy, his wife, was very attractive and great supporter of the arts. They had big concerts in the what's now called the Kennedy Center. So there was it was almost like spring is coming. Like right now, people are feeling good because spring is coming after this awful winter, though things still remain awful. So everybody was very hopeful. Then December 22nd, 1963, a bullet assassinated Kennedy. You ask your dad, anybody of my generation knows where they were when they heard that. The illusion, the fantasy died right there. Now, there were problems even before that. I mean, Tom Hayden wrote this thing called the Port Huron Statement in 1961, which is a declaration of principles about how to get rid of, about trying to get rid of poverty and oppression and wars in this country. And a guy named Michael Harrington wrote a very good book called The Other America, talking about how there's so much poverty in America, but you don't see it. They gave the example of taking a commuter train, and the commuter train with all the people in their ties and suits, reading their newspapers, and the tracks go over the ghetto areas of the city into Midtown, where whether it's Chicago or New York, the people from the suburbs, the white people in the suburbs with their ties and suits, get off. And they've been reading their Wall Street Journal or whatever on the way in. They didn't see the poverty that this passed through. So Michael Harrington wrote this book called The Other America, but the other America being the America you can't see. And he had 10 chapters, I think, on the ghetto, poverty in the ghettos, poverty of the problem of the farm workers, West Virginia coal miners. So there was a social conscience that was developing. LBJ gets in, and two things. One, he does keep part of the dream alive because he's able to pass, because of Kennedy's death. Kennedy tried to get some voting rights and civil rights bills passed, but probably might not have been able to do it. Johnson, who's a master legislator, he knew how to, if anybody's really interested in how that works, read The Power Broker by, not The Power Broker, read the biographies about Lyndon Johnson by Doris Kearns Goodwin. But he knew how to deal with the legislature. He was majority leader. And he was able to pass these anti-poverty programs and these voting rights bills and Civil Rights Act. But what he also did, and this actually started under Kennedy, but it was very low key, we already had some troops in Southeast Asia. And the war was expanded because Johnson started, there was a pretext, and he called the Gulf of Tonkin invasion, and he decided to really up the number of troops and pouring in hundreds of thousands of troops, of soldiers. So this is all going on, and people are protesting. Protests were a little different then than they are now, but these protests today, I think, are very exciting. Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of the protests, interesting. A lot of people of color with whites. Back then, a lot of the protests were, I think, mainly white people in the streets. So it's really very exciting to see today's protests. But so the war is going and everybody's being drafted. That lottery scene in the movie, by the way, didn't happen until after the demonstrations, not before. But anyway, and then 1968 came around. We were heavily in Vietnam, people getting killed, Americans. The church, one of the churches near me, on the little bulletin board they have in front of most churches saying when services start, they kept a running total of the number of Americans, the number of Vietnamese killed, and they changed it every week. The numbers were staggering. And then in 1968, which is the presidential election year, Johnson was so gung-ho on the war, and we were in the streets, a lot of people were in the streets trying to march against it. I was in Wisconsin. I was working for a guy named Gene McCarthy, who was running in the primaries against Johnson. But basically, as you said, MLK, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th of 1968. Lyndon Johnson, the day after the Wisconsin primary, which Gene McCarthy won, announced that he would not seek re-election. So Bobby Kennedy looked like he was going to be the presidential candidate. And if Bobby were elected, things would have been totally different. Bobby was loved by whites, working class whites, and blacks. I believe he would have brought the war to the end. He was Attorney General of the United States under his brother. But June, I'm not sure it was June 4th or whatever, but I remember being up studying for the bar exam that night when a friend calls me at 2 a.m. and says, Bob had been shot. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. All the euphoria, the hopes were gone. Humphrey was a good man, and Humphrey probably opposed the war, but he was a loyal vice president. Almost like, I'm not going to compare him to Pence, there's no comparison. Humphrey was a real good Minnesota liberal, and he was against the war, but he wouldn't confront Johnson openly, and that's why the demonstration is going. The president was going to be elected. You had a Richard Nixon. Nixon has to be grateful for Donald Trump. Never have any of my friends ever thought we'd say anybody would make Richard Nixon look good. But Donald Trump makes Richard Nixon look like a statesman. So it was really important that Richard Nixon wanted to bomb the hell out of Vietnam. Humphrey was saying, no, we got to get out of there and try to peace. So that's what happened with those demonstrations. That's why people were marching. I mean, throughout the late 60s, I was down in Washington, marches on the White House, on the Mall, the Washington Monument, 500,000 people going to march. So this was what was happening. And then they were trying, the 7 people mainly, because Bobby Seale was an add-on, if you will. Bobby was not the anti-war person, but Bobby was a civil rights person, if you will. The others were mainly anti-war, though they were also aware of the civil rights struggle. They went to the demonstration at this convention to show the world and hopefully to stop Humphrey from being nominated, to get somebody who was more pro-peace. The rest you did see in the movie as to what happened.
So Kunstler argues that
sorry to go on so long about that, but it was just
no. There's the context, and I'm just wondering about this. I don't know how significant this is, but Kunstler outlines a conspiracy between the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, and LBJ to prevent or crush any demonstrations against the war, poverty, imperialism, or racism at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. So there's some feeling maybe that, the forces are arrayed against us here. Maybe there's some leftover feelings about conspiracy and the deaths of all of these leading progressive figures. And LBJ did have a lot of progressive policies, but his war policy certainly wasn't peaceful.
His war policy was not peaceful. The Great Society, social welfare programs, the Voting Rights Act, bringing in Medicare. He had a lot of great domestic programs, and it's a shame, but an understandable one, that his legacy is overridden by what happened there. But yeah, Daley and Nixon were, I wouldn't say there was a conspiracy between Johnson and Daley, because the Justice Department, I'm not sure Johnson would have been that upset, but certainly Ramsey Clark wanted the permits granted. George Wallace had also run for president. George Wallace being the segregationist governor, Alabama, who basically ran for president on keeping blacks out of colleges and out of schools. No, not even pussyfooting around. He was admittedly a racist. And Daley was, and demonstrations certainly broke out after Martin Luther King died. There were riots all across America. Exactly what you're seeing now, mostly peaceful, but yes, stores were burned. People looted. Absolutely, that did happen. Again, the minority, the action of the minority, get more coverage than what the good people were doing. But Daley saw himself as, nobody's going to mess with my city. nobody's gonna mess with my city. And he wanted to tamp it all down. And then so what happened at the convention was almost the police riot, them clubbing heads. Again, Sorkin did a great job because that's real and as well as some newly shot film. But that's what happened. Those guys busted heads. And the report by Daniel Walker, who was been governor of Illinois, the report called the Walker Commission, which investigated what happened, and they declared this was a riot by the police. And the whole world was watching. That was the demonstration. Interesting. The demonstrators, when the demonstrations happened in the Capitol, everybody was chanting, "The whole world is watching," as the police were beating the heads of the demonstrators. And the world was watching. That was on cable. That was what the equivalent of cable news. That was on news all over the world. The scenes of cops at this supposedly Democratic convention, bashing people's heads. And you know when else the whole world was watching? That got all the publicity? It's when Bobby Seale was gagged and chained, a black man in an American courtroom. And again, the whole world was watching. And that's what that's one of the reasons we wanted to show the people that. That's why we did the book. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons Sorkin did the movie, because of the parallels what's happening now.
Well, we're surprisingly, I mean, already we're a little short on time here. We're kind of coming to the end of the hour. But I just, maybe Rory, if you have any questions or if you want to take any audience questions, maybe we could,
There was an audience question about the movie. Did they consult you guys at all for the transcripts?
No, the transcripts are in the public domain, which basically means you can't copyright a transcript. Anybody can use it. So though the movie and we both use the transcript of our sources, they didn't consult us. They actually, in terms of the publicity, take that back. The Netflix PR people got in touch with us when they started doing publicity for the movie. They wanted to know who from that time was around, both as witnesses and both as journalists who covered the trial and the demonstrations. They wanted us to give them that information so they can get in touch with them to help with the publicity for the movie. So yeah, we did have that, definitely had that kind of contact with them.
And right, so you put this together, and the book had gone out of print. So this was, this is a 50th anniversary edition that coincides with the release of this movie. What kind of response have you gotten?
Well, the original book, by the way, sold close to 200,000 copies, I think 180,000 copies, and everybody's reading it. We're getting great reaction to it. Obviously, most people know about the movie. Look, there've been so many bad things about the pandemic. So, to say that the bookstores weren't open so people couldn't see the books and see the fact that the title of the book is the same as the movie, and therefore pick up the book, can't. That's not. It's nothing to even complain about. The reviews are good. The audio book, by the way, there's an audio book which is fantastic.
That's what I listened to the audiobook.
It's an audio book of this. It's available either on the Simon & Schuster. By the way, we have a website, chicago7trial.com, which has a lot more information. There's a section called related links, which tells you other places to go for information about the individuals and about the defendants. And basically, there's so much that was going on there. Well, you can read it there in the website to see everything that happened. But the audiobook was nominated as a finalist for an audiobook award. It was 21 actors. I mean, Simon Schuster really spent the money. You don't have 21 actors, and these were real actors. Jeff Daniels,
J.K. Simmons, I believe.
Yeah, J.K. Simmons, it's a judge. Christopher Jackson, I think he's on
Jackson from
Hampton. There's a couple Broadway actors I saw in there.
There were a lot. I mean, literally 21 actors doing the audiobook. And I'd say that's both have been brilliantly received, but the audiobook particularly because it's more of a 21st century medium.
Well, I just want to, I'm sure you've been through it all over the last 50 years and been commended, but I just want to thank you for putting this book together with your co-editors. slaving away over it and having the foresight to realize that this would be something that people would like to read and that nobody was going to read a 22,000 page trial transcript. But if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. And I think our experience here gives truth to what some of the defendants were saying at the end about how this trial and the judge would go down in history, would go down in infamy in the case of the judge. And, as a famous American court case and event. I want to thank you so much, Mark Levine, for being here with us. I just want to let you know that this program, Book Sandwiched In, was made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library Foundation. If you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation at nhfpl.org/donate to help support the collections, programs, and services of the library throughout the year. And I want to thank Rory Martorana, librarian here at the New Haven Public Library, for joining us. Seth Godfrey, who is a co-coordinator on the program and really oversees it, and just a whole host of other people at the library who have given their support to this program.
And I'd like to thank you, Isaac, and Rory, and the library for having this program, because people are interested in what's going on. So I really, really appreciate it. And I've done a good number of these, and I think the questions of you and yours and Rory's have really been spectacular, very thoughtful.
Thank you so much. I think people got a lot out of it, and I mean, we really appreciate your taking the time.